Welcome, my children. Come closer, sit by my side. Today I'm going to tell you about a war that has been etched into the deep pages of history, one that took place in the ancient lands of the Far East. This wasn't just a war of soldiers, it was a war of trade, politics, and ambition. The First Opium War, a conflict where the West knocked on the doors of the East, a story so complex that its echoes can still be felt today. China, the land of the Silk Road, home to spices, tea, and fine porcelain, a civilization so rich that it left the West in awe for centuries. But behind all this wealth lay isolation, a nation that had built high walls, shutting itself off from the outside world, keeping Western goods at bay with a cold, unyielding stance. And then there was Britain, the ruler of the seas, a rising power fueled by the Industrial Revolution. Britain wanted a share of China's riches, but there was no easy way in. That is, until opium became a weapon in their hands. And once that happened, the flames of conflict began to rise. Today I will tell you how those flames ignited, how empires clashed, and how ordinary people were caught in the storm. This isn't just the story of a war, it's the story of a turning point between East and West. So, let's begin. Let the shadows lift, and let history speak. All right, kids, let's dig deep into our story now. Close your eyes and imagine it, a vast, magnificent land, China. A country rich with mountains, rivers, and endless plains, like a generous mother providing for her people. Isolated from the rest of the world, China was like a kingdom unto itself. It had everything it needed: endless rice fields, silk production, tea plantations, and an unmatched mastery of porcelain. There wasn't much reason to rely on the outside world. This mighty empire followed what we now call the closed-door policy, keeping its distance from foreign influences. To the Chinese, Western goods were unnecessary, and Western culture was strange. They traded their silk and tea for silver, but showed little interest in what Europe had to offer. Western merchants spent years trying to break through China's resistance, but time and time again, they hit a solid wall. And this is where opium entered the picture, carried in the hands of British traders. Grown in India, this drug wasn't just another product for the British. It was a key to unlocking China's doors. Originally, opium had been used for medicinal purposes, but as its euphoric and highly addictive properties became more apparent, its darker side started to emerge. When British merchants first introduced opium to China's coastal cities, especially Canton, they knew it wouldn't stay just another commodity. The effect spread like wildfire. One taste and people were hooked. As addiction took hold of the population, British traders made fortunes, and the silver that once flowed into China now flooded into Britain's coffers instead. But the true tragedy wasn't just in individual addiction. It was how opium corroded the entire Chinese society. Farmers, laborers, merchants, even government officials fell under its influence. The smoke from opium pipes didn't just cloud minds, it slowly poisoned the nation's economy and social structure. The Chinese Empire eventually realized the devastating impact of this drug, but stopping it was no easy task. The trade, controlled by British merchants, had also drawn in local dealers and smugglers, making it even more widespread. With each passing day, more silver drained from China's treasury, replaced by the slow decay of opium addiction. And so, my dear listeners, this is how the West's hunger for trade and the East's vulnerability came together to write one of history's darkest chapters. But this is just the beginning. The ending of this tale is filled with sorrow and downfall. Before we get there, though, we need to see how a simple trade turned into a full-blown war. So pause for a moment and think, how could a single drug seeping into a nation's veins change the course of history forever? Ah, kids, the subtle breeze that brought opium into China soon turned into a raging storm. This storm didn't just tear apart minds, it shredded the very fabric of an entire society. Let's dive into the devastating impact this cursed substance had on the people of China and their way of life. First, let's talk about how opium affected individual lives. At first, it lured people in like a mirage, offering a false sense of peace and an escape from worries. But once the doors to that dreamland were opened, turning back became nearly impossible. People began to lose their physical health. Bodies weakened under the haze of opium smoke, and immune systems crumbled. You could see it in their pale faces, their eyes filled with the hopelessness of addiction. But it didn't stop with individuals. If a father became addicted, the entire family felt the impact. The hands that once worked the fields grew weak, and the bread that should have fed the kids disappeared. Families started spending their last coins just to buy more opium. Women and children bore the brunt of this burden, often left to face the harsh realities of life on their own. And this wasn't just a story of individuals, my kids. Opium's poison seeped from the smallest households to the highest pillars of society. When farmers could no longer tend their fields, food production plummeted. When workers were too weak to labor in factories, the gears of the economy slowed down. Opium's toxic fumes didn't just harm personal health. They choked the productivity of an entire nation. Then there was the toll on China's treasury. As addiction spread, the country's silver reserves began to vanish. People sold their last valuable possessions just to buy more opium, draining their economic strength day by day. British traders capitalized on this, flooding China with even more opium while sucking away its silver like a giant vacuum. As the Chinese empire's wealth dried up, the country's economic balance crumbled. This economic collapse tore apart China's social fabric too. A nation once known for its strength and independence started rotting from within. Trust between people eroded as opium smuggling spread. The gap between rich and poor widened, and social unrest simmered. Yes, my kids, opium wasn't just a drug, it was a poison running through the veins of society, corrupting everything it touched. It took hold of people's bodies and souls, wrecking their economic and social foundations. So, what would the Chinese Empire do when they realized the scale of this disaster? In the next part of our story, we'll see China's struggle to resist this poison. Listen closely, because this history is packed with lessons not just for one nation, but for all of humanity. My dear children, history is often shaped by the struggles of nations fighting against disaster. And the Qing Dynasty's battle against the opium crisis is one such story. A tale of resistance, tragedy, betrayal, and hard-earned lessons. Let's take a closer look at the first steps China took to ban this deadly substance. By the early 1830s, the Chinese Empire could no longer ignore the devastating effects of opium. The people's health was deteriorating, the economy was crumbling, and moral values were breaking down. The imperial government realized that things couldn't go on like this any longer. And so, the historic decision was made. Opium was to be banned across China. When the authorities announced this ban, they did so with firm determination. The sale, import, and use of opium were strictly prohibited. Imperial decrees were issued throughout the land, warning traders to stop dealing in opium and threatening severe punishments for those caught using or storing it. But, my children, enforcing a law on paper is one thing. Eradicating a deeply ingrained problem is another. Opium trade wasn't just profitable for British merchants. Local smugglers and even corrupt Chinese officials were benefiting from it. This made enforcing the ban incredibly difficult. Though opium was now illegal, it became even more valuable on the black market. British traders continued sneaking it into China via their ships, and local dealers found ways to bribe their way around the law. And perhaps the saddest truth of all? Some of the very officials responsible for enforcing the ban were themselves complicit in the trade. Corruption weakened the empire's resolve and shattered public trust in the government. Bribes didn't just render the law useless, they also made people question whether the empire was truly committed to this fight. Of course, not everyone turned a blind eye. Some loyal officials took a stand and worked tirelessly to enforce the ban. But their efforts were constantly undermined by smugglers and corrupt bureaucrats. Ah, my children, sometimes a nation's greatest obstacles come from within. The Qing Dynasty had taken its first step towards saving itself from this poison, but it wasn't enough. The opium trade continued to thrive in the shadows, and corruption remained its strongest ally. But did China give up? No, my children, the Qing Dynasty would soon escalate its fight against opium, leading to one of the most turbulent wars in history, and in the midst of this battle, a leader would rise, one determined to rid China of this cursed substance once and for all. Stay with me because this story is far from over. It is filled with hard lessons, acts of bravery, and heartbreaking consequences. Ah, my dear ones, now let's turn our eyes from China to the west, across the ocean to England, because this story has another key player, the British East India Company. This wasn't just a trading company. It was a force that shaped the course of history, and when it comes to the opium trade, its impact was undeniable. By the late 18th century, the British Empire ruled over vast territories. India was one of its most prized possessions, and the British East India Company controlled not just trade but also political power there. However, Britain faced a major problem in its trade with China, the trade imbalance. The British were buying massive amounts of tea, silk, and porcelain from China, but they had little to offer in return. Because of this, Britain was losing huge amounts of silver to China, and that's when opium came into the picture. The East India Company had massive opium plantations in India. Thousands of workers toiled for long hours processing the opium poppy, which was then refined and shipped off to China. But the company didn't just oversee production, it managed the entire trade, from distribution to pricing, making sure that profits flowed straight into British hands. This trade became a cornerstone of Britain's global economic strategy. Opium was in such high demand in China that British merchants were able to exchange it for massive amounts of silver. As addiction spread, China's silver reserves started flowing into Britain's coffers. This trade imbalance was suddenly flipped in Britain's favor, and the wealth gained from opium became one of the financial backbones of Britain's Industrial Revolution. But my dear ones, Britain's strategy wasn't just about economics, it was also about control. The opium trade was not only a source of wealth, but also a tool of political leverage. By making China dependent on opium, Britain strengthened its own position while weakening the Qing Dynasty. Sadly, few in Britain questioned the morality of this trade. Politicians and merchants knew exactly what opium was doing to the Chinese people, yet they saw no reason to stop. To them, what mattered most was keeping Britain's economy strong and expanding its global influence. Ah, my dear ones, this chapter of history shows us just how ruthless the pursuit of profit can be. The British opium trade wasn't just a business deal. It was a moral dilemma, with consequences that would shape nations for generations. The impact of this policy was devastating for both China and Britain, leaving scars that wouldn't easily fade. But this story isn't over yet. There's still much more to tell. Stay with me, listen closely, because history is about to take us even deeper. Ah, my dear children, now we come to one of the most remarkable and fearless figures in our story, Lin Zexu. A man of courage, integrity, and unwavering justice. He wasn't just an official, he was a symbol of China's dignity and resistance. His story is one of sheer determination, a struggle that would change the course of history. By the early 19th century, opium had spread through China like a poison, weakening society and crippling the economy. The Qing Dynasty had tried numerous times to stop the crisis with laws and regulations, but most of them were either poorly enforced or easily bypassed by clever traders. But then, in the midst of this chaos, Lin Zexu emerged, a man who was ready to take a bold and uncompromising stand against opium. In 1839, Emperor Daoguang appointed Lin Zexu as the governor of Guangdong province with a clear and urgent mission: stop the opium trade and rid China of this toxic substance once and for all. But this was no easy task. British merchants and corrupt local officials had been making enormous profits from the trade, and they weren't going to let it go without a fight. The moment he took office, Lin Zexu launched an aggressive crackdown in Guangzhou. He wasted no time punishing local traders and officials involved in the opium business, making it clear that there would be no leniency. Then, he turned his attention to the British merchants. He issued a strict ultimatum: hand over all opium supplies immediately and put an end to the trade. For the British, this was a shocking blow. Up until then, China's resistance had been weak and inconsistent. But Lin Zexu was different. He was a man of unshakable resolve. In Guangzhou, massive amounts of opium were seized from British merchants, and under Lin Zexu's orders, they were publicly destroyed. But this wasn't just a routine disposal, it was a statement. Around 200 chests of opium were dumped into massive pits, mixed with salt water, and rendered completely unusable. This act wasn't just about getting rid of the drug. It was a message to the world that China would no longer bow to the opium trade. Of course, this bold move enraged the British merchants and their government. They saw the destruction of their opium as a direct attack on their business and national pride. To them, this was an insult that couldn't go unanswered. And so, Lin Zexu's defiance became the spark that ignited the First Opium War. Lin Zexu's story is not just about a nation's struggle, it's about a leader's sense of duty and honor. He showed both his people and the world what justice and resilience truly meant. But my dear children, history is rarely kind to those who challenge the status quo. This fight would come at a great personal cost for Lin Zexu, and our story is about to take a darker turn. But don't worry, I'll tell you everything, piece by piece. After all, history is not to be rushed. Every detail holds a lesson and every chapter carries a meaning. Ah, my dear ones, history is full of moments when two great powers are inevitably drawn into conflict. The rising tensions between Britain and China over opium were one such moment, a clash set in motion by fate itself. Now, let me tell you how these two giants found themselves at odds, as diplomatic failures and rigid stances pushed them closer to war. The year 1839 went down in history as the year China took its strongest stand against the opium trade. Lin Zexu's bold actions in Guangzhou shook British traders and even rattled the British government, causing outrage back in London. To Britain, China's decision to shut down the opium trade wasn't just an economic threat, it was an insult to national pride. So in response, the British government decided it was time to take a firmer stance. At that time, Britain's economy was deeply tied to the opium trade. The opium grown in India was shipped to China, making British merchants and investors massive profits. But China's crackdown on this trade threatened those profits. Turning the situation into more than just a commercial dispute, it became an economic lifeline for Britain. At first, the British government tried to resolve the matter through diplomacy, but my dear ones, these efforts led nowhere. British representatives demanded that China relax its stance on the opium trade, but Lin Zexu and Qing officials firmly rejected these requests. To them, banning opium was about protecting their people's well-being and preserving their moral values. With diplomacy failing, tensions only grew worse. British merchants were expelled from Chinese ports, massive stockpiles of opium were destroyed, and trade routes were disrupted. For Britain, this was unacceptable. What started as a trade dispute had now become a battle for pride and sovereignty. Britain then escalated its pressure, issuing threats and pushing for negotiations. But Lin Zexu stood his ground, refusing to give in. His unyielding stance left Britain feeling that a military solution was the only option left. British warships arrived off China's coast, not just to restore trade, but to make a clear statement about Britain's power and determination. And yet, my dear ones, one of the greatest tragedies of this era was the complete breakdown of communication between these two nations. This conflict could have been resolved through diplomacy, but deep-rooted distrust and misunderstandings made that impossible. That failure set the stage for one of history's most unfortunate wars, the First Opium War. History doesn't just teach us about trade and diplomacy. It reveals human weaknesses and ambitions. Because sometimes conflicts can be avoided before they spiral into war. But in this case, history took a different course, and the clash between these two great powers became inevitable. Now let's take a closer look at how this growing tension exploded into full-scale war, and how it changed the course of history forever. Stay with me, because this story has much more to teach us. My dear listeners, sometimes a nation's resilience rises like a heavy storm cloud, but no one can predict exactly when the lightning will strike. After years of patience, China had finally gathered those storm clouds in its resistance against Britain's opium trade. And then, out of nowhere, the storm erupted. The First Opium War was no longer just a trade dispute. It had become a battle of pride and sovereignty between two powerful empires. The war broke out in the dull, gray days of 1839. While China took a firm stance against the opium trade, Britain decided to respond with military force. But here's something important to understand, my friends. China was not prepared for war. After centuries of internal stability and isolationist policies, the mighty empire had fallen behind in military modernization. Its vast lands were defended by soldiers with outdated training and weapons, standing against the disciplined British Army and its superior naval forces. Britain, on the other hand, was ready. The Royal Navy was a dominant force on the world's oceans. As they sailed toward China's shores, their naval superiority gave them an enormous advantage. The British had planned their military strategy with such precision that China's ability to defend itself, both by land and sea, quickly crumbled. The first battles erupted near China's southern coastline. Guangzhou became the British military's initial target. At first, the conflict consisted of small skirmishes, but China's defenses were almost non-existent. Their outdated weaponry was no match for Britain's modern firearms. Chinese generals were skilled in land warfare, but their naval forces had been neglected for too long. This weakness became painfully obvious as the war progressed. The British Royal Navy swiftly overpowered China's naval forces, surrounding Guangzhou with ease. Meanwhile, Britain's long-term strategy began to take shape. They weren't just looking for military victory, they wanted to force China into economic submission, ensuring the continuation of the opium trade. This goal was worth far more to them than a battlefield win. China, caught completely off guard, wasn't just facing a military defeat. This war was a harsh reminder of how centuries of isolation and internal stability could suddenly be shattered. However, we shouldn't see China's early struggles as a dead end. History has a way of testing a nation's resilience. The hardships China faced were immense, but in time they would lead to a new fight and a path toward rebuilding. Against the strategic maneuvers and overwhelming strength of the British Royal Navy, China's traditional army could barely hold its ground. But this war wasn't just a test of military might. It became a test of spirit. Cracks in China's defenses were becoming visible, and soon this once mighty empire would have to break through its own self-imposed isolation, facing both external enemies and internal turmoil. Yet, as with any war, victory came with a price. This conflict would leave deep scars on history and forever change the relationship between Britain and China. The First Opium War wasn't just another battle, it was a turning point, a moment that would reshape the course of history. And now, my dear listeners, let me take you deeper into this great struggle and everything that followed. My dear listeners, sometimes a nation's fate is shaped by a handful of major conflicts, like storms gathering on the horizon. The First Opium War was one of those turning points, leaving its mark on history as it crashed against China's once mighty walls. Today, I'm going to take you back to that war, to the battles fought on land and sea that shook the world at the time. For China, this was the beginning of some of its toughest military struggles. As Britain cemented its dominance over the seas, things became even more complicated for China. Cities like Guangzhou, Ningbo, and other coastal areas became battlegrounds for some of the war's fiercest clashes. Back then, no one knew how China would respond to the British fleet approaching its shores. The Royal Navy wasn't just prepared to control the waters, it was also fully equipped for land operations, something China hadn't expected. Guangzhou was one of the war's most critical flashpoints. The Chinese tried to put up a resistance, but they were facing an enemy so well armed and disciplined that it easily overwhelmed their defenses. With modern naval tactics and powerful firepower, the British forces pushed forward. China, on the other hand, relied on outdated muskets and limited artillery to defend it. But Britain had some of the most skilled naval officers of the time, cutting-edge weaponry, and a strategic approach that allowed them to surround the city like an unstoppable storm. The naval battles around Guangzhou exposed just how unprepared the Chinese military was. Their fleet was simply no match for Britain's advancing warships. It was like a wooden shield trying to stop a cannonball. With superior firepower and naval tactics, the British quickly tore through China's defenses. The Chinese fleet, still relying on old-fashioned ships and outdated strategies, was completely outclassed in this new era of warfare. But after securing victory at sea, the British turned their attention to land battles. Cities like Ningbo and other key locations saw similar outcomes. When it came to land combat, the situation wasn't much different. China, lacking modern military strategies, was forced to retreat again and again in the face of British advances. The Chinese army was massive, stretching across a vast empire. However, most of its soldiers were trained in traditional warfare rather than modern combat techniques. They lacked the discipline, equipment, and strategic planning that the British forces had mastered. The Royal Navy and British ground troops worked in perfect coordination, making it nearly impossible for China to hold its ground. China's land defenses weren't as weak as its navy, but the British had a strategy for that too. They didn't just attack from the sea, they advanced on multiple fronts. The assault on Ningbo was a perfect example of Britain's dominance. China's ground forces, already struggling with outdated weapons and tactics, were quickly overwhelmed by superior British artillery. In just a matter of days, the city fell, leaving its gates wide open to foreign control. At this point in the war, Britain's modern weapons and battlefield strategies were forcing China into an inevitable surrender. The Chinese people were just beginning to realize how ruthless and unstoppable this new kind of warfare could be. The battles in Guangzhou, Ningbo, and other cities weren't just defeats, they were warnings of what was to come. With every loss, China's military and society felt the strain, pushing the nation toward a slow but steady collapse. As the British kept winning battle after battle, they saw that China's resistance was crumbling. But this war wasn't just about military power. It was a direct challenge to China's sovereignty and way of life. These battles weren't just about territory or trade. They were about two vastly different worldviews colliding on the stage of history. And so, my dear listeners, what happened next would change the course of history forever. My children, after every great war, people start looking for peace. No one wants more bloodshed. They long for stability. The first Opium War had shaken China to its core, leaving destruction in its wake. The Qing Dynasty had no choice but to acknowledge its dire situation against a powerful enemy. But remember this, every nation, no matter how broken, always seeks a way forward. And sometimes, that path begins at the negotiating table. As the war dragged on, the Chinese government found itself in an increasingly desperate position. The military weaknesses of the Qing Dynasty and their lack of modern warfare capabilities left them with little choice but to seek a diplomatic resolution. But let's be honest, China's attempts at diplomacy weren't just about peace. They were in many ways a sign of surrender. The Qing officials sat at the negotiation table many times, but as you know, sitting at the table doesn't always mean you have equal bargaining power. One of the biggest challenges for the Qing government was their weak position in the war. They had suffered devastating military defeats, and the British, armed with modern weapons and superior tactics, held complete dominance. Chinese territory was exposed, defenseless against this massive military force. Cities had been ravaged by the war and the morale of the people was crumbling. This left China with very little leverage during the negotiations. Still, the Qing leadership knew that continuing the war would only bring more destruction. Their people and lands had already suffered enough. They wanted to stop the bleeding, to find a solution before things got even worse. But despite their efforts, every attempt at diplomacy seemed to hit a wall. The British, as the clear victors, dictated the terms. They weren't just flexing their military strength. They were also exploiting China's diplomatic vulnerability. After the defeats in key cities like Guangzhou and Ningbo, China focused even more on securing a peace deal. The Qing Dynasty tried to maintain some form of resistance, but the longer the war dragged on, the heavier the burden became, economically, socially, and politically. A resolution became not just desirable but necessary. However, Britain approached these peace talks from a position of total dominance. They weren't looking to negotiate in good faith, they were setting the terms. China's weakened state from the very beginning of the war was the biggest obstacle to fair negotiations. The Qing Dynasty tried to regain some footing, but the reality was clear. Britain had gained too much ground, both militarily and strategically. The Qing leaders knew they had to make peace, but they also understood that their enemies viewed this as a total victory. Meanwhile, the people of China, exhausted by war, hardship, and loss, simply wanted an end to the suffering. And so the Qing Dynasty's diplomatic efforts became a desperate search for an escape. But remember, my children, peace is not always won on equal terms. More often than not, the victors get to dictate the outcome, while the defeated have little choice but to accept. China's struggles in this war weren't just about losing battles. They were also symbolic of a much deeper cultural and national decline. These negotiations didn't just end a war. They cemented China's weakened status in the eyes of the world. But even in loss, change is inevitable. The end of this war marked a low point for China, but it also set the stage for the transformations that would come in the years ahead. My children, history can be ruthless sometimes. People either fight to reclaim what they've lost, or accept their losses and move forward. But remember, every loss can lead to something new. Every ending can spark a new beginning. The Treaty of Nanjing was one of those turning points. Signed at the end of a difficult period, it marked a major shift in history. But this new path China was about to walk down wasn't exactly bright or promising. With the First Opium War coming to an end, this treaty was meant to reshape China's fate after suffering major military and diplomatic defeats. As the war's clear winner, Britain sat at the negotiation table, ready to draft an agreement that would secure its own interests. From the very start, China had been at a disadvantage, and that imbalance carried over into the peace talks. The Treaty of Nanjing was the final stamp on that injustice. Signed in August 1851, the treaty changed the course of an empire and the lives of its people. China was forced to make major concessions. The most significant one, the loss of Hong Kong. The island was handed over to Britain, marking the beginning of a British rule that would last for years. Hong Kong wasn't just a piece of land. It became a powerful trading hub, a cultural bridge, and a stronghold of British influence in Asia. For China, however, losing Hong Kong was a deep wound, both symbolically and strategically. But the loss of Hong Kong wasn't just about land. It signaled the beginning of an even deeper economic crisis. China had long operated with a closed economy, but foreign pressures, particularly the opium trade, forced it to open up. The Treaty of Nanjing accelerated that process. Chinese ports were now open to British merchants and eventually to other Western powers as well. This meant China was losing control over its own economy. The treaty didn't just strip away land, it weakened China's economic independence. Britain took full advantage of this, reshaping China's trade policies to serve its own interests. And the treaty didn't stop there. China was also forced to pay Britain a massive indemnity, money that drained the country's resources and deepened its economic struggles. But the financial cost wasn't the only issue. The psychological impact was just as devastating. A nation doesn't just measure its losses in land or money, it also weighs them in morale, in how much faith its people still have in their leaders. The Treaty of Nanjing was more than a political defeat. It was the start of a cultural shift that China wasn't prepared for. Now, my children, here's the question we need to ask. Was this treaty a complete and total loss for China? At first glance, absolutely. Losing Hong Kong, sacrificing economic independence, and paying a heavy price, these were all crushing blows. But true strength isn't just measured in wealth, land, or military power. Real strength comes from resilience, from the ability to adapt, and from the will to rebuild. At the time, though, this was a hard truth for China to accept. The losses cut deep, and the national trauma was undeniable. But remember this: every setback in history creates an opportunity for change. The Treaty of Nanjing was a harsh reality check, but it also planted the seeds for transformation. Over time, China would rise again, determined to reclaim its place in the world. Back then, though, hope was in short supply. My children, one of the harshest truths about history is that wars don't just leave scars on battlefields, they leave deep marks on people's hearts and minds too. By the end of the First Opium War, China didn't just lose land, the real blow was felt in the spirit of its people. The defeat shook the nation's confidence. The Qing Dynasty had promised absolute power and protection to its people, but that promise started to crumble after such a crushing loss. The emperor, once seen as a strong leader, had lost the people's trust, and in their hearts, the people were left feeling hopeless and uneasy about the future. For the first time, they saw the weaknesses in their government, and many began to doubt whether their leaders could truly protect them. Opium hadn't just threatened China's borders, it had also damaged the very fabric of its society. Countless families suffered under the weight of this war. The economic devastation made life incredibly difficult, especially for farmers and the working class. Heavy taxes and war reparations pushed many deeper into poverty. China's economy, once strong, had been shaken to its core, and the social structure was cracking. At that moment, the people were filled with anger and frustration, a breaking point that would later spark major changes in Chinese society. But war doesn't just test a nation's internal strength, it also reshapes its relationships with the outside world. The First Opium War changed China's relationship with the West on every level, from the government to the everyday people. For centuries, China had remained closed off, allowing only limited trade with foreign nations. But after the war, the West was no longer on the outside looking in. They were now pushing their way into China's economy, politics, and daily life. This turning point completely altered China's position in the world. Once a country that had stood apart from foreign influence, China now found itself forced to interact with, and in many cases, submit to, Western powers. This wasn't just a cultural shift, it was an economic and political one too. The British and other Western nations expanded their trade rights in China, using their power to shape policies in their favor. China's weakened state only made it easier for foreign powers to increase their control. And this, my children, was the beginning of what history would call the Century of Humiliation. The First Opium War was the moment when China was forced to acknowledge the dominance of Western powers, militarily, economically, and politically. The growing pressure from foreign influence, combined with internal struggles, created a deep sense of sorrow among the people. For a long time, China became a symbol of defeat and helplessness in the face of Western expansion. It wasn't just military losses, it was a loss of national pride, because when a country loses not only its land, but also its identity, it leaves behind a painful emptiness. The Century of Humiliation was marked by a series of unequal treaties with Western nations, each one further weakening China's independence. Slowly but surely, China was pulled out of its isolation and placed under foreign influence. But remember, my children, every dark chapter in history eventually leads to the dawn of something new. While China endured a period of humiliation, suffering, and struggle, the spirit of resilience never completely faded, and one day, this once mighty empire, belittled and broken, would begin its fight to rise again. Today, when we look back at China's darkest times, we can better understand the weight of history. But every moment of crisis carries a lesson. By learning from the past, we can build a stronger future. Because behind every challenge, there's always a path forward. My children, behind every victory, there's more than just a strong army and brave leadership. Sometimes victory comes from diving deep into history, where strategy and intelligence prevail. The British victory in the First Opium War wasn't just about military strength. It was about technological superiority, strategic planning, and naval power. At the time, Britain was a rapidly industrializing nation equipped with some of the most advanced military technology in the world. Meanwhile, China was still deeply influenced by its feudal system and was far from prepared to face the West in battle. The British had modern weapons and a technological edge that gave them a massive advantage over Chinese forces. Rifles, cannons, warships. Each one played a crucial role in shaping the outcome of the war. The British Royal Navy played a key role in the conflict. In fact, naval power was one of the biggest factors that determined the war's outcome. Britain's superior fleet allowed them to reach distant lands quickly, while China lacked a strong naval force. On top of that, Britain's well-planned military strategy shaped the war's progression. Every major operation was carefully thought out and executed at the right moment on Chinese soil. With all these factors combined, Britain's victory was inevitable. China's biggest weakness in this war was, without a doubt, its long-standing policy of isolation. For years, China had deliberately cut itself off from the outside world, keeping interactions with the West to a minimum. Because of this, China missed the chance to learn about Western military advancements and strategies. And when the war came, the consequences were devastating. While Britain benefited from the Industrial Revolution and modern warfare tactics, China struggled to resist with outdated, traditional methods. And so, my children, when a war is won, it's not just victory celebrations that follow. War always brings long-term consequences, and for China, the aftermath of the First Opium War marked the beginning of a difficult journey. China wasn't just militarily defeated, it was entering a period of economic, social, and political transformation that would reshape the entire nation. Even after the war, the opium trade continued to spread in China. The British and other Western powers kept pushing opium into the Chinese market, not just as a trade commodity, but as a tool that would leave a lasting impact on Chinese society. Opium addiction weakened the population, making the social structure even more fragile. Despite knowing the devastating effects, many Chinese people fell into addiction, which led to widespread poverty and suffering. On an even larger scale, the expansion of the opium trade made China more economically dependent on the West. The treaties China signed with Western powers forced the country to keep participating in the trade, making opium more than just a drug. It became a symbol of Western economic dominance over China. While Britain profited immensely from the trade, China suffered as its economy, workforce, and people were slowly being drained. The opium crisis cast a dark shadow over China, worsening year after year. The years following the war saw more and more people falling into addiction, an economy increasingly tied to foreign influence, and a government that was losing control over its own land. Opium was no longer just a substance. It had spread like a disease through all layers of Chinese society, leaving scars that would last for generations. My children, history isn't just about events and figures, it's about the lessons we take from them. When a nation fails to protect its independence and resist foreign control, it doesn't just lose land, it loses its spirit. The struggles China faced during this dark period remind us of the true value of freedom and sovereignty. My dear ones, today I'm going to tell you about a war that didn't just change the fate of one nation, but reshaped the course of world history. The First Opium War left a deep mark not only on China's past, but on the global stage as well. This war marked the end of China's centuries-long isolation, changed its relationship with the Western world, and became the beginning of its loss of independence. Despite being a powerful civilization throughout history, China's internal struggles, closed economy, and deep mistrust of the West slowly distanced it from the world. This isolation turned out to be one of its biggest mistakes, one that eventually exposed its weaknesses. And the First Opium War made those weaknesses clear for the whole world to see. This war, a true turning point in Chinese history, also heightened Western interest in the Far East and led to new strategies for economic and military dominance. The First Opium War wasn't just a military conflict. It was a clash of cultures, economies, and power. Western nations established a dominance over China that would last for years, and in losing its historical strength, China found itself opening the door to Western influence. With this war, China was gradually pulled into the capitalist world, and its national sovereignty began to erode. But my dear ones, every ending is also the beginning of something new. The trauma caused by this war didn't just shake China's social structure. It also opened the door to a new era of Westernization. The First Opium War was just the start of a series of even greater disasters. The suffering and losses endured during this time were not just the aftermath of a single war. They marked the beginning of what would later be known as China's century of humiliation. These hardships set the stage for yet another catastrophe, the Second Opium War. Opium was no longer just an illicit trade. It had deeply embedded itself in Chinese society, shaping the nation under Western influence. All of these factors created more obstacles for China in its fight for independence and laid the foundation for another war. Because, unfortunately, China's struggle to reclaim its national pride and sovereignty would be shaped by ongoing conflicts with the West, turning into a long and painful journey. And so, my dear ones, this war didn't just reshape China's foreign relations. It also exposed the deep contradictions within the country itself. The Qing Dynasty was simply not strong enough to stand against the West. It had to undergo an internal transformation, a revolution, and let go of centuries-old traditions. This war marked the beginning of China's rebirth as a nation, forcing it to evolve socially and culturally. As we leave behind the First Opium War and its lasting consequences, history reminds us that some wounds don't heal quickly. China's pain wasn't something that could be forgotten in a short period of time. The First Opium War wasn't just an event in the past. It planted the seeds of future suffering. The introduction of opium, the devastating addiction it brought, the breakdown of Chinese society, and the weakening of the Qing Dynasty, all paved the way for another war. And that next war came in 1856, the Second Opium War. By then, China's political and economic systems were already heavily influenced by Western powers, and the suffering of the Chinese people had only worsened. Western nations continued to pressure China, using past treaties to further solidify their dominance. This ongoing oppression inevitably led to another large-scale conflict. The Second Opium War would only deepen China's wounds and make its struggle for national independence even more complicated. My dear ones, history is deep and complex. Wars aren't always fought over land. Sometimes they're battles for cultural and ideological dominance. China emerged from the First Opium War deeply wounded, but it also gained an important lesson. Every loss signals the start of something new, and every disaster forces a nation to rediscover its identity. By sharing these stories with you, I'm not just telling you about one country's history. I'm sharing a part of humanity's collective past. This war left us with invaluable lessons, reminding us to reflect deeply and learn from the mistakes of those who came before us. The First Opium War wasn't just a conflict, it was the story of a nation's transformation, its fight for sovereignty, and the shifting balance of power in the world. And so we close this cold and heavy chapter of history. But remember, my dear ones, history isn't something that stays in the past, it continues to shape the present, and the future is built on the lessons we take from it.